Enjoy your last week in my house, Judge. Then the deed proved it was never his. And 3 days later, he was begging. Enjoy your last week in her house. That was the caption. 9 words, no punctuation, sent at 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in chambers reading a brief about a disputed easement. Below the words was a photograph. My bed, the one my grandmother's quilt had covered for 11 years. The one with the walnut headboard I'd refinished myself over a long weekend in April of 2015. And in it, tangled in my sheets, my husband Daniel and a woman named Gina Marchetti. Her phone was raised over them both. She was smiling into the camera the way people smile when they think they have already won. I could smell, from memory, the lavender laundry soap I bought in bulk at the Kroger on Franklin Road, the same soap on those sheets, and it made my stomach turn. I sat very still. The brief slid off my knee onto the floor. What Gina did not know, what neither of them knew, sitting in that photograph like 2 cats who'd gotten into the cream, was exactly whose house they were in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back, because a moment like that one only means anything if you understand what came before it, and what I had quietly been building the whole time they thought I was asleep. My name is Nina Holloway. I was 51 years old that Tuesday. I grew up in Cock County, Tennessee, in a rented house with a tin roof that sang when it rained, and a father who fixed transmissions for a living and never once made more than $31,000 in a year. My mother cleaned rooms at a Days Inn off I-40 and kept every receipt we ever generated in a shoebox, labeled in her careful hand, Keep. I learned to read contracts before I learned to drive because my father got cheated on a truck loan in 1984, an extra $4,200 buried in fine print. And I watched him sign it because he was too proud to say he didn't understand. I decided somewhere around age 9 that no one would ever bury anything in fine print on me. I put myself through the University of Tennessee on a partial scholarship and a job at the campus library that paid $5.15 an hour. I ate a lot of ramen. I graduated, went to law school on loans that took me until I was 38 to pay off, and I clerked and I ground. I made assistant district attorney. Then I made a name arguing appeals, the dry paper part of the law that most people find boring and I found beautiful. Because on appeal, there is no jury to charm, there is only the record, and the record either says what you claim or it does not. In November of 2013, the governor appointed me to the Tennessee Court of Appeals. I was a sitting appellate judge. I wrote opinions that other lawyers cited. I knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how property and deeds and marital estates behaved when they were dragged into a courtroom, because I was one of the people who decided what happened to them. Remember that. They didn't. I met Daniel Holloway in 2009 at a fundraiser for the Nashville Symphony, back when I was still a prosecutor. He was charming in the effortless way of men who have always been told they're charming. He sold commercial real estate, good years and lean years. Mostly lean, if I'm honest, and he laughed at my jokes and remembered that I took my coffee black with exactly 1 sugar. We married in the spring of 2011 at a little chapel in Leaper's Fork with 42 guests and a cake from a bakery that has since closed. My friend Karen Whitfield, who I'd known since our first-year property class in 1993, stood beside me in a green dress and cried and told me I deserved every good thing. Karen became a family lawyer. Karen, remember, is important. The early years were genuinely good. I won't pretend otherwise, because the lie of a story like this is to say the whole thing was rotten from the start. It wasn't. We took a road trip through the Smokies in the fall of 2012 and split a warm beer on the hood of the car because the cooler ice had melted, and Daniel wrote our initials in the dust on the windshield, and I thought, this is what a life feels like when you finally stop bracing for it. Here is the one thing I did that I never once explained to him, because it wasn't a secret so much as a habit stitched into me by my mother's shoebox and my father's truck loan. Everything we owned, I bought. and everything I bought, I put in my name. Not out of suspicion, out of arithmetic. In 2014, we bought the house, a 3,400 square foot brick farmhouse on 4.5 acres outside Nashville, off a gravel road near Arrington, with a wraparound porch and a kitchen I fell in love with the instant I saw the light come through the east windows at 7 in the morning. It cost $612,000. Daniel's commissions that year had been thin, his credit thinner, and the mortgage lender took one look at his file and one look at my judicial salary and steady record and told us plainly the loan would go faster in my name alone. So it did. The deed was recorded in Williamson County to Nina R. Holloway, a single grantee. I paid the note down aggressively. I hate debt the way some people hate spiders. And by 2019, I owned it free and clear. No mortgage, no lien. Mine, on paper, in the vault of the Register of Deeds, in ink. The investment accounts at Meridian Capital were the same. I opened them in 2011 with money I'd saved before I ever met him, and funded them from my salary. By that Tuesday in Chambers, they held about $840,000, and the statement said, on every single page, Nina R. Holloway, individual. The two cars, my Volvo and the Ford truck Daniel drove, were titled to me because I'd paid cash for both. Even the savings we called ours, the roughly $95,000 in the joint account at Pinnacle Bank, had been fed almost entirely from my direct deposit, and I had 11 years of statements that proved the flow of every dollar. I want to be clear about something because it matters to how this ends. I never did any of this to trap him. I did it because I am a woman who grew up watching a shoebox labeled Keep, and I could no more leave a title vague than I could leave a stove on. It was simply who I was. But who I was turned out to be the one thing Gina Marchetti never bothered to find out before she raised her phone over my bed and pressed send. The erosion started so slowly I almost talked myself out of noticing. It was the phone first. Daniel had always left it face up on the counter, screen bright with whatever game he was half playing. Sometime in the fall of 2024, it started living face down. Little thing. Then it started coming to bed with him, tucked under his pillow, and I'd wake at 3 a.m. to the small gray glow of it against the ceiling and the sound of him typing with one thumb, slow and careful, the way you type when you're choosing your words. Then came the working late. Daniel sold real estate. Real estate closings do not, as a rule, happen at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. But suddenly, there were client dinners and site walks after dark, and a listing in Brentwood that required his personal attention 4 evenings a week. He started wearing a cologne I didn't buy, something with cedar in it, and he went to the gym with a devotion he'd never shown in 14 years of marriage. He lost 11 pounds. He bought 2 new shirts, slim cut, from a store in the Gulch where a single shirt costs $145. I noticed the receipt because I notice receipts. My mother made sure of that. I filed each of these away in the quiet place inside me where I keep things I am not ready to act on. I did not confront. Appellate judges do not react to the first draft of the record. We wait for the full transcript. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things. There were 3 moments that told me I wasn't. The first was in January of 2025. We were watching Wheel of Fortune, of all things, a Tuesday ritual older than half our furniture, me with a chipped blue mug of tea, Daniel with his feet on the coffee table, and his phone buzzed on the arm of the couch. He glanced at it, and his whole face changed. Just for a second. A softness, then a snap of alarm, and he turned the phone over so fast the case clicked against the wood. Work, he said, before I'd asked. That word again. When someone answers a question you haven't voiced, they are telling you where the body is buried. The second was in March. I came home early from a canceled oral argument and found a receipt in the truck's cup holder. I was looking for a napkin, from a restaurant called Etch, downtown, for $216, dated a night Daniel had told me he'd grabbed a sandwich at his desk. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine I would never have ordered because I don't drink Malbec. I sat in the truck in our own driveway for 20 minutes holding that receipt, and I didn't cry. I just felt the temperature in my chest drop a few degrees, the way a room does when a door somewhere in the house opens onto winter. The third was the worst because it involved my mother's quilt. In April, I stripped our bed to wash the linens and found, caught in the fold of the fitted sheet on Daniel's side, a single, long, dark hair. My hair is short and going silver. I held it up to the window light for a long moment. Then I put it in a small envelope, wrote the date on the front, and slid it into the back of my filing cabinet in the study, in a folder I labeled, Old Habit, My Mother's Daughter to the Bone, Keep. That was the moment something in me stopped being a wife and started being a lawyer again. Not with rage, with a kind of terrible calm. I began, quietly, to gather the record. I want you to understand who I did not become in those weeks, because the temptation in a story like this is to picture a woman shattering. I didn't scream at him. I didn't check into a hotel and sob. I made tea in my chipped blue mug. I wrote my opinions. I said good morning. And underneath the ordinary surface of my days, I organized. I photographed the bank statements. I printed the Meridian Capital account histories going back to 2011 and highlighted, in yellow, the deposits that were mine, which was to say, all of them. I pulled the recorded deed from the Williamson County Register and confirmed, as I already knew, that it named exactly one owner. I gathered 11 years of pay stubs and mortgage records and car titles into a single accordion folder, the way I'd done 100 appellate records, methodically, completely, so that when the moment came, the story the paper told could not be argued with. Then, on that Tuesday in May, at 2:14 in the afternoon, Gina Marchetti sent me the photograph and the 9 words, "Enjoy your last week in her house." I learned later who she was. Gina Marchetti, 34, a real estate agent Daniel had met at a broker's open house in the fall of 2024. She drove a leased BMW she couldn't afford, and she had convinced herself, because Daniel had let her believe it, that the farmhouse on the gravel road was his house, that the accounts were his, that the wife was a dull woman in a black robe who would slink away with a suitcase and leave the two of them, the porch and the east-facing kitchen, and the walnut headboard. In the photo, she was already redecorating, with her eyes. She had told me to enjoy my last week in her house, and she'd said it with a smile, because she thought the arithmetic was on her side. She had never once, in 8 months, thought to ask what I did for a living beyond some kind of judge. She had never pulled the deed. She had gotten her law from television. That was the whole of it. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I set my phone face down on my desk. Face down, the way his had been for a year, and I noticed the irony and did not smile at it. And I picked the fallen brief up off the floor, and I finished reading it. Because I had a duty to the parties in that case, and my private life did not get to steal from them. I signed off on my draft opinion at 4:40. Then I closed my chamber's door, and I made one phone call. I called Karen Whitfield. "It's me," I said. "I need you to be my lawyer now, not my friend. Can you be both by dinner?" There was a pause, and then Karen, who had cried in a green dress at my wedding, Karen who had known me since we were 22 and broke and certain the world owed us nothing, said, "Tell me what he did." Not what happened, what he did. She knew me. She knew I don't call the machine into motion over nothing. I told her. The photo, the 9 words, the year of small gray glows against the ceiling. And then I told her the part that made her go quiet in a different way. "Karen," I said, "the house is mine, sole deed. The Meridian accounts are mine, individual, funded from my salary, documented since 2011. The cars are titled to me. The joint account is 94% my direct deposit, and I have every statement. He thinks, she thinks, that I'm going to be the one packing a suitcase. I heard myself, and my voice was steady in a way that frightened even me. I'm not going anywhere. He is. Karen let out a slow breath. Nina, she said, they have no idea who they're dealing with, do they? No, I said. They really don't. We met that night at her office on West End, and we spread 11 years of my life across the table. Karen is a meticulous woman, her legal pads color-coded, her exhibits tabbed, and when she saw the accordion folder I'd already assembled, she laughed, a short, surprised sound, and said, "You realize most clients come to me with a shoebox of chaos and a story that changes every 10 minutes. I thought of my mother's shoebox labeled Keep, and I didn't tell her that's exactly where I'd started, 40 years and 1 lifetime ago. Here is what we did over the next 9 days, and I'll tell you plainly, because there was no violence in it and there was nothing I'm ashamed of. We did paperwork. Karen prepared a complaint for divorce, Tennessee grounds, adultery, and irreconcilable differences pled in the alternative. We attached the deed. We attached the Meridian statements. We attached the car titles and the bank records, and, because Gina had been generous enough to text a confession with a timestamp and a photograph of the man in question in my bed, we attached that too, printed and certified, metadata intact. I did not need the photo to prove infidelity, but I wanted it in the record, in a manila exhibit folder, because a woman who raises her phone over another woman's bed and presses send should someday have to watch a court clerk stamp that image into permanence. I did 3 quiet, practical things of my own. First, I called Meridian Capital and spoke to my account manager, a careful woman named Priya, and confirmed that the accounts were individual and that no one but me had authority over them. They were, and no one did. Daniel had never been added. He'd never asked. He assumed, the way he assumed everything, that what was mine was ambient, just there, like the air, belonging to no one and therefore to him. Second, I moved the roughly $95,000 in the Pinnacle joint account into a new individual account in my name, entirely legal, my own traceable deposits, and I left exactly $1,400 behind, enough to cover the automatic bills that ran through it, because I am not a person who lets the power get shut off out of spite. Karen raised an eyebrow at the $1,400. "You could leave 0, she said. You'd be within your rights." I told her I didn't want to give a courtroom, someday, a single sentence that made me look small. She wrote that down. Third, I did not tell Daniel anything. For 9 days I made tea in my chipped blue mug and said good morning and let him believe I was the dull woman in the black robe who hadn't seen the photograph, or had seen it and gone numb. He was distracted, buoyant, cruel in the oblivious way of a man who thinks he's about to trade up. One night, he actually told me, over reheated lasagna, that he'd been doing a lot of thinking about what makes us happy. I said, "I think that's healthy, Daniel," and I meant every ice-cold syllable of it, and he heard none of them. The system, I should tell you, first appeared to be entirely on their side. Gina certainly thought so. She sent 2 more texts that week. She couldn't help herself. One said, "You'll want to start looking at apartments. There's a nice complex off Nolansville that takes people on a budget." The other, 2 days later, was a photo of a paint swatch, sage green, held up against my dining room wall, with the words, "Redoing this first." She was decorating a house whose deed she had never read, owned by a woman whose job she had never bothered to learn. Every message she sent I forwarded to Karen, who added it to the exhibit list with a growing, grim delight. "She is doing our work for us," Karen said. "I have never had a witness build my case with this much enthusiasm." We set the date. Karen would file the complaint on a Thursday morning. The papers would be served on Daniel that same afternoon at the farmhouse, where, I knew from a year of his patterns and a glance at his calendar app, which he still hadn't thought to password protect because he still didn't think I mattered enough to check, he would be, because Gina had asked him to be there to meet the contractor she'd hired, without permission, on a house she didn't own. 3 days after those papers landed, he was begging. But let me tell it in order. Thursday morning, I did not go to Chambers. I took a personal day, the first in 2 years. Karen filed at 9:04 I got the confirmation on my phone while I stood in my own kitchen, watching the 7 o'clock light do what it had done every morning for 11 years. Pour gold across the butcher block counter and the chipped blue mug in the drying rack. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table, oak, scarred, the table where I'd graded law clerks' bench memos and paid the mortgage that was mine and mine alone, and I waited. The process server was a laconic man named Earl who charged $75 and found Daniel at 1:30 that afternoon in the driveway, standing beside Gina and a contractor's truck, holding a roll of paint swatches. I wasn't there for that part. I heard about it later because Earl was a talker once the paperwork was signed. Daniel had taken the envelope thinking it was something about the listing. He'd opened it in the driveway. Karen told me Gina had actually laughed at first. Laughed because she thought divorce papers meant the wife was finally getting out of the way. Then Daniel got very quiet, Earl said, and read the second page, the one that listed the assets and their owner of record, and the color went out of him standing right there in the gravel. He called me 11 times that afternoon. I answered none of them. I was not being cruel. I was being correct. My lawyer had instructed me not to speak with the opposing party outside of counsel, and for the first time in my marriage, I let the law do the talking, which is the only thing the law had ever asked of me and the only thing Daniel had never once respected about me. That evening, he drove home, to the house he still, even then, believed was somehow his, and he came in through the kitchen door and found me sitting at the oak table with a single manila folder in front of me and my chipped blue mug of tea gone cold at my elbow. "Nina," he said. His voice cracked on the one syllable of my name. "What is this? What did you do?" I want to describe him honestly because the man who walked in was not the charming man from the Symphony fundraiser in 2009. He was gray. His new slim-cut $145 shirt was rumpled and dark under the arms. His hands were shaking. And standing behind him in the doorway, uninvited, having followed him in her leased BMW because she couldn't stand not to know, was Gina Marchetti, still holding, absurdly, the roll of sage green paint swatches. I did not stand up. I have learned from the bench that the person who stays seated controls the room. "Sit down, both of you," I said. "There's tea if you want it. There's a lot to go over." Gina did not sit. Gina said, with the last of the confidence draining out of her voice, "This is my house, Daniel's house. You need to be out by—" "Gina," I said, and I slid the first document across the oak table, turned so she could read it right side up, because I wanted her to have every advantage of clear sight. "This is the recorded deed to this property, Williamson County Register of Deeds. I want you to read the name of the owner. Read it out loud if you like." She looked down. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere the refrigerator hummed, and the 7 o'clock light was long gone, and the overhead bulb buzzed faintly, the one Daniel had promised to replace for 2 years and never had. "Nina R. Holloway," she read. Her voice had gone small. "Single grantee," I said. "No co-owner. No Daniel. The mortgage was paid off in 2019 by me. There is no lien on this house. There is no bank that can foreclose. No name but mine on the title. This has been true since the day we bought it in 2014, when the lender looked at Daniel's credit and declined to put him on the loan at all." I let that sit. "You told me to enjoy my last week in your house. Gina, you have never spent a single legal second inside a building you had any right to. Not one." Daniel had lowered himself into the chair across from me. He was staring at the folder like it might strike him. I slid the next document over. Meridian Capital, $840,000, more or less. Account holder, Nina R. Holloway, individual. Opened in 2011 with money I saved before I met you, Daniel. Funded every year since from my salary. You were never a signatory. You never asked to be. Do you remember why? He didn't answer. Because you assumed it would always just be there for you, like the house, like me. I laid down the third and the fourth. The car titles, the bank records with 11 years of my direct deposits highlighted in yellow, my mother's daughter to the last. The Volvo is mine. The truck you drive is mine. Titles in my name, paid cash 2018. The joint account you were counting on has $1,400 in it, which I left there on purpose to keep the lights on, because I'm not a small person, and I won't let a courtroom someday pretend I am. Everything else in it was mine, and it's been moved, legally, traceably, every dollar accounted for. The silence in that kitchen was enormous. I have sat through a lot of silences from the bench. The silence when a jury files back in. The silence when a man realizes the record does not say what he swore it said. This was that silence. Then I said the plain sentence, the one that made the whole thing legible in a single breath, because I wanted neither of them to be able to tell themselves later that they hadn't understood. Daniel, I said, I am a judge on the Tennessee Court of Appeals. I have spent 12 years deciding exactly what happens to houses and deeds and marital estates when they come apart. I know this area of law better than any attorney you could hire, and I built my own affairs from the beginning so that on the day something like this happened, the paper would already be finished. It's finished. There is nothing here in your name. There was never going to be. And then I did the thing I had planned. The small and total gesture. I reached into my cardigan pocket and I set on the oak table in front of Daniel a single key on a plain ring. He looked at it. He looked up at me. That's the key to the storage unit off Highway 96, I said. Unit 114. I moved your things there this week. Your clothes, your golf clubs, the guitar you don't play, the box of your mother's china. It's paid through the end of the month. That key opens the only thing in the state of Tennessee that is currently, legally yours. I folded my hands, which is a 10 by 10 room of your own belongings and nothing else. That was when Gina made a sound I won't forget. Not a scream, a kind of collapse of the breath, a small, wet gasp, and she sat down at last, in the fourth chair, uninvited, because her legs had stopped holding her. The paint swatches slid off her lap and fanned across my kitchen floor, sage green against the old pine boards, and nobody picked them up. I don't understand, she kept saying. He told me it was his. He said it was his house. He said the accounts. I know what he told you, I said. And here, only here, did I let a little tenderness in, because contempt is not a thing I enjoy carrying. He lied to you the same way he lied to me. The difference is that I checked 40 years ago in a rented house with a tin roof, and you got your law from a paint swatch. He is not a man of property, Gina. He never was. He is a man who married one and hoped no one would ever read the deed. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was a ruin. Nina, please, we can. I made a mistake. We can fix this. You don't have to. And there it was. 3 days after the papers, he was begging. Not for me. I understood that even then, and it's why the begging didn't move me an inch. He was begging for the house, for the accounts, for the soft, ambient life he'd assumed belonged to him like the air. He reached across the oak table for my hand, the same table where I'd once believed we'd grow old, and I moved my hand back to my lap, gently, the way you move a cup away from a child's grabbing fingers. You have a key, Daniel, I said. Unit 114. Go on. I did not raise my voice once. Karen told me afterward that she'd half expected, when I described it to her, some grand speech, some settling of years of accounts. But by the time the two of them were sitting gray and gutted in my kitchen, the accounts were already settled. They'd been settled in a register of deeds in 2014, in a brokerage account in 2011, in a shoebox labeled Keep in Cock County in 1984. All I had to do that evening was read them the total. The divorce took 4 months. It was not close. Daniel hired a lawyer, a good one actually, a man named Pruitt, who took one look at the deed and the account records and the certified confession Gina had so kindly texted, and, I'm told, put his head in his hands. There was nothing to litigate. You cannot divide what was never joint. Tennessee is an equitable distribution state, and separate property, properly kept separate and documented, stays separate. The law I had spent my life inside did exactly what the law is supposed to do when the record is clean. It told the truth. Daniel walked away with his clothes, his golf clubs, the guitar he doesn't play, his mother's china, and the leased BMW's problem, because Gina, I heard this later from Karen, who heard it from Pruitt, left him within the month, the instant she understood there was no house at the end of it. She had never wanted Daniel. She'd wanted the porch and the east-facing kitchen and the walnut headboard. And once those turned out to be mine, Daniel was just a 53-year-old real estate agent with thin commissions and a storage unit. And she was gone. The last I heard, he was renting a one-bedroom off Nolansville Road. Near, I noted, without any joy at all, the very complex she'd suggested I look into, the one that takes people on a budget. Now let me tell you about the good part, because a story that ends only in a cold kitchen is not the story I want to leave you with. Karen came out to the farmhouse the Saturday after it was final. She brought 2 ribeyes and a bottle of good Tennessee whiskey, and she stood in my east-facing kitchen while the light poured across the butcher block, and she said, "God, Nina, this light. No wonder you never let this house go." My mother's quilt was back on the bed. I'd had it cleaned, and I'd replaced the sheets entirely, new ones, because some things you don't wash back into use, you simply retire. We ate at the oak table, the same one, and I'll tell you it felt different with a friend across it than it had with a liar. Karen raised her glass. My chipped blue mug was in the drying rack behind her, the one I'd held through every one of those long gray months, and I looked at it while she talked. "To the woman," Karen said, "who read the fine print when she was 9 years old and never stopped." I laughed, and my eyes stung, and I thought about my father signing a truck loan he didn't understand, and my mother's shoebox, and the girl under the tin roof who decided no one would ever bury anything in fine print on her. I did one more thing that fall, and it's the thing I'm proudest of. I took $25,000 from the Meridian account, money that was mine, that had always been mine, and I endowed a small scholarship at the University of Tennessee in my mother's name, Ruth Ann Chandler, for a first-generation law student from an East Tennessee county who could not otherwise afford the first year. The application asks one question I wrote myself. Tell us about a time you insisted on understanding something that others told you to leave alone. Every year I read the answers at that same oak table, and every year I cry. And it is a good kind of crying, the kind that means the fine print finally protected somebody. The farmhouse is still mine. The mortgage is still paid. The deed still reads in the vault of the Williamson County Register, Nina R. Holloway, single grantee. And I have framed a copy of it, I'll admit that much vanity, and hung it in the study beside the folder marked Keep. Sometimes, at 7 in the morning, I stand in the kitchen with my chipped blue mug and watch the light come through the east windows. And I think about the 9 words Gina Marchetti sent me on a Tuesday afternoon, so sure of herself, so sure the arithmetic ran her way. Enjoy your last week in her house. She was wrong about the house. But she was right about one thing, and I've decided to keep it as a kind of gift. It was, in the end, a woman's last week in that house. Just not mine. It was hers. Her last week believing a man's lies could hand her a home he never owned. And it was Daniel's last week, mistaking the woman he married for the furniture. Me? I wasn't spending a last week anywhere. I was home, in the only house whose deed I ever needed to read, and I intend to enjoy every single week of it for the rest of my life.